Sorry.
Okay, good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. Nous nous trouvons aujourd'hui sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé des peuples algonquins Anishinaabe ici à Ottawa. Pleased to be joined here by a number of my colleagues, Parliamentary Secretary Chang, of course, MP Zaid, MP Kayabaga, Elizabeth May, MP May, MP El Khoury, MP Ali, and my colleague in the House of Commons, Jenny Kwan, who you'll be hearing from in a few seconds. Also, really pleased to welcome Catherine Burton and Carol Sutherland Brown, and advocates and parents directly affected by our announcement today, as well as Don Chapman from the Lost Canadians, who some of you know quite well. Nous pouvons définir la citoyenneté canadienne de différentes manières. Certains d'entre nous ont eu la chance, comme moi, de naître au Canada. D'autres sont de nouveaux arrivants qui ont choisi le Canada, se sont installés dans nos communautés et ont obtenu par conséquent la citoyenneté. And we have citizenship by descent, individuals who are born outside of our country to a Canadian parent. As Canadians, we're a diverse group, but we all share a common set of values, take pride in who we are and what our country stands for. We're a country that supports human rights, equality, and respect for all people. There's no doubt that Canadian citizenship is highly valued and recognized around the world. We want a citizenship to be fair, accessible, with clear and transparent rules. Not everyone is entitled to it, but for those who are, it needs to be fair. That's why when issues arise around citizenship law, it's important that Parliament addresses them. Les modifications législatives apportées à la loi sur la citoyenneté en 2009 ont imposé une limite de première génération à la citoyenneté par filiation, ce qui signifie qu'un parent citoyen canadien peut transmettre la citoyenneté à un enfant né à l'extérieur du Canada s'il est né au Canada ou naturalisé avant la naissance de l'enfant. Aujourd'hui, nous présentons le projet de loi C-71. The proposed legislation will extend citizenship by descent beyond the first generation in a way that is inclusive and upholds the value of our citizenship. If passed, the bill extends automatic citizenship to anyone who was born outside the country to a Canadian parent before the legislation comes into force. We also introduced amendments to respond to issues raised at parliamentary committees as well as in the courts. They will restore citizenship to those we call lost Canadians. That could be someone who was never able to become a citizen or lost citizenship because of previous and outdated legislative provisions. While the government previously brought forward changes that fixed the status of most lost Canadians, a small impacted cohort remained. Ces changements régleront la plupart, sinon la totalité des Canadiens perdus et leurs descendants qui cherchent à récupérer leur citoyenneté. Les changements concernent également le statut des descendants canadiens qui ont été assujettis à la limite de première génération. Le projet de loi présenté aujourd'hui propose également des règles claires pour l'acquisition de la citoyenneté canadienne par filiation. À sa mise en œuvre, le projet de loi établira une nouvelle façon de confirmer la citoyenneté en remplaçant la limite de la première génération par l'évaluation des liens manifestes avec un autre pays. Under the new legislation, children born abroad to a Canadian citizen who is also born outside Canada will be a Canadian citizenship from birth if their parent can demonstrate they have a substantial connection to Canada. As long as a Canadian parent who was born outside of Canada has accumulated 3 years of time spent in Canada before the birth of the child, they'll be able to pass down their citizenship to their child. Finally, we wanted to take this opportunity to continue to minimize differential outcomes as much as possible for children born abroad and adopted by Canadians compared to children born to Canadians. Tout enfant adopté à l'étranger par un parent canadien avant la date d'entrée en vigueur de la loi pourra se voir octroyer la citoyenneté, même s'il aurait été auparavant exclu par la limite de la première génération. Et pour les enfants nés à l'étranger et adoptés par des citoyens canadiens, le même critère s'appliquera une fois la loi entrée en vigueur si le parent adoptif né à l'extérieur du Canada peut démontrer qu'il a des liens importants avec le Canada. L'enfant adopté pourra se voir octroyer par conséquent la citoyenneté. Le projet de loi C-71 redonnera la citoyenneté à ceux qui l'ont perdue et créera un processus clair et cohérent pour l'avenir concernant nos règles en matière de citoyenneté par filiation. The amendments build on the good work the House of Commons and Senate have done on Bill S-245, while improving on the proposals in the Senate Public Bill and comprehensively addressing the issues raised by the courts. La citoyenneté canadienne fait partie de notre identité. C'est une chose qui nous lie aujourd'hui, des valeurs communes qui sont la démocratie, l'égalité et l'inclusion. Avec le projet de la loi d'aujourd'hui, nous cherchons à améliorer la loi sur la citoyenneté. Finally, there's been a lot of talk about conservatives like Pierre Poilievre wanting to take away people's rights. They say there's nothing to fear. Canadians should just trust them. This is an example of conservatives having taken away Canadians' right and something they hold most dear to them in their citizenship. So when conservatives say nothing to fear, Canadians need to take note of what they've actually done in the past. This law fixes. This is not Mark fixes it. This is not Mark Miller talking. This is the courts that have said so clearly. Thank you. Je vous remercie. A little more on that. Now over to my colleague, MP Jenny Kwan.
Thank you very much, Minister. Let me first say thank you, and most particularly, I want to acknowledge the advocates and the family members who's been impacted by this unconstitutional and unjust law that created a second-class citizen, what we now call as lost Canadians. People will remember 15 years ago, it was the Conservatives that brought in this law. It was the Conservatives that stripped children of Canadian parents the right to pass on their citizenship automatically to their children. As a result of that, in effect, the Conservatives, have created a second-class citizens in Canada. And how is this important? And why is it important? I have become a member of parliament since 2015. I've talked endlessly to advocates like Don Chapman, to family members like Carol Sutherland, along with family members who's here, Catherine Burton, and so many others, how their lives are being impacted as a result of this unjust law. Families, Canada is a global community of Canadians. People travel, people study abroad, people work abroad, people fall in love abroad, people have families abroad. But guess what? As a result of this law, it meant that for some of those families, they have had to be separated from their children. Some children have been rendered stateless. The law's implications are significant. And Canadian families had had it and had to take the government to court. And the court had ruled that that law was unconstitutional. It was punitive, frankly, unnecessarily. And that's why we're here today. The Conservatives had an opportunity to fix this last year. We had a Senate private member's bill before us at committee, albeit the Senate bill was narrow in scope. But we worked endlessly across partisan lines with different members, with government members. Many of them are standing here at the committee, with the Greens, with the Bloc, and I even talked to the Conservatives. And they swore up and down and said that they want to fix this. But what did they do at committee? They filibustered the opportunity to fix this for more than 30 hours. And even after the fact, that bill is ready to go, actually, to be called for third reading in the House of Commons. They delayed and delayed and delayed and is nowhere to be found. So when it became clear that that was not going to happen, what was imperative that needed to be done for the families, to do justice for the families, was for the government to introduce the bill. I've spoken with, over the years, successive ministers, from Minister McCallum to Minister Hassan to Minister Fraser and to now Minister Miller. And we finally have this bill before us today. So I do want to acknowledge and say thank you to Minister Miller for doing this important work. It's hard work, it's complicated, but it needed to be done. The bill has just been introduced in the House of Commons, and I am optimistic that it has addressed the issues that I have brought to their attention through the amendments in S245, in addition to addressing concerns for international adoptee families and adjusting the timeline so that this, in effect, can become law and so that we don't have lost Canadians anymore, so that we don't have second-class citizens anymore, that we're equals as Canadians. This is what this bill is about, so it's a historic moment, it is an important moment. It is how the House of Commons should work for us to work across party lines for the community. And if the Conservatives say they support the community, if Mr. Poilievre says they support the community, then I would ask them to not obstruct progress of this bill, pass this bill so that it can become law and right the historic wrong that they brought on Canadian families 15 years ago. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. No. I was supposed to actually introduce the next speaker, which is Catherine Burton, from a family's point of view. My apologies, please.
Please don't apologize. Thank you, Gui. Hello, merci. My son just said, please don't cry, but it is truly a moment for my family. So just a very short synopsis, albeit we reside in Boston. I was born and raised in Canada, and, well, actually, sorry, I apologize. I was born in the U.S., and my mom, to your point, my mom and father fell in love in the U.S. and had me. I passed on it was considered at the time that my mom passed her Canadian citizenship to me, and despite being status, my boys got a rejection letter from Citizenship and Immigration that they were not considered Canadian citizens. And I would rightfully say, not only are they not lost Canadians, but quite the Canadians. They want to come here, they want to learn language, they want to go to school here, they want to do so many things here because this is what they consider home, this is what I consider home. And I want to just thank Minister Miller and his team. When I first approached Minister Miller, I immediately brought it to his attention as an unintended consequence to outdated law, and he immediately knew what I was talking about. And so with that, I want to just thank not only Minister Miller, the entire team, but also the staff. As a former staffer, I can always say that the lifeblood is that with scheduling, comms, chief of staff, deputy chief of staffs, all of the people who you don't see, they are truly unsung heroes. I also want to acknowledge Senator Kuzner from Cape Breton. Thank you so much, Senator. He was probably one of my first calls when I got the letter and I was irate. And by the end, we were laughing and joking, but he gave me a roadmap on how to change and impact change. So thank you so much, Senator. I appreciate that. So for us, my mom always said, never let the federal government define you. She was a fighter of Bill C-31. And I always tell my boys, we don't allow the federal government to define us, but when they do, we forcefully and respectfully push back. And with that, we did. And we worked together with many advocates, many elected officials, many families, just to Minister Miller's point, to make this about equality and make it equitable and also make it right. So I want to thank everybody in this room today who has worked so hard. I want to thank everybody, and most importantly, thank my family, my two boys, Graydon, Miles. Can you stand up? So you will see them at the next citizenship event and waving and saying that they are proud and rightful citizens, not lost. Trust me, I find them every morning doing something that they shouldn't be doing, like wrestling, screaming, yelling. And to my husband, Chad, my biggest advocate, thank you so much for pushing me to fight the principled fights. I trust that we can all collectively agree this is a wonderful bill. It rights some wrongs and does what's right in the views of so many Canadians. And it's not just us and standing in front of you, many who don't even realize they're impacted until they go and until they apply for their children, their grandchildren. And just to be clear, this wasn't just for my children, but for many generations to come. So for those First Nations who many live and reside in the U.S., similar to the Jay Treaty, we're making this equitable on both sides. So thank you, appreciate it. Walalio. Thank you. I love you guys. Kesalu. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, I did the same thing.
I'm very grateful today to be here and for the leadership of Minister Miller for tabling this important legislation today. I am also very grateful for the Ontario Court ruling that struck down the after first generation limit as unconstitutional. This cruel and retroactive provision of the Citizenship Act has had painful consequences for me and for many Canadian families. I have been working with two other mothers, Christina Matulahakla and Majda Debagi, all of us proud Canadians who happen to have moved abroad for study and for work temporarily. We came together frustrated after trying to effect change over the last decade and made a written submission to the CIM committee during the very extensive study of Bill S-245. And I would like to thank those committee members of CIM, MP Kwan, and all the members who worked so hard on studying this. I am a fourth-generation Canadian citizen and have lived in Canada most of my life. However, my own daughter, Marisa, through no fault of her own, does not have the ability to pass her Canadian citizenship on to her children, despite having lived in Canada for the majority of her life. I was born in Kingston, Ontario, into a military family. My dad, Colonel John Orton, came from Alberta. He attended the Royal Military College, graduating in 1939, and he fought in the entire Second World War, in the campaign in Italy and in the liberation of Holland. I married a Canadian, Ian Sutherland Brown, Marissa's father, in 1981. His family came to Canada in the 1840s, before it was even Canada. His father also served in the Second World War with the Canadian Royal Engineers. Early in our marriage, we moved to Saudi Arabia, where we worked for an American-run eye specialist hospital. Our daughter was born in Saudi Arabia in 1985. I could not easily return to Canada for the birth. I didn't have OHIP. I didn't have a doctor in Canada. I had 6 weeks of maternity leave, which was the case back then. But I did have health care in Saudi Arabia. And at that time, prior to 2009, it was not necessary to give birth in Canada to pass on Canadian citizenship. I registered her birth immediately with the Canadian Embassy in Riyadh, and she had a passport at 5 weeks of age, a Canadian passport, and she has maintained her Canadian passport ever since then. We returned to Canada to live when my daughter was 2, and she grew up in Ottawa, living, studying, working, voting, and, yes, paying taxes. She followed my footsteps abroad for graduate school and ended up marrying a man in the UK. She fell in love. Like me, she was unable to return easily to Canada to give birth. Again, she had no OHIP, no doctor in Canada, and her prenatal care, her postnatal care, and her maternity leave were all in the UK. Marissa is a proud Canadian who's lived most of her life in this great country, but she cannot pass her citizenship down to her children. There was no path. So here might have been the end of 5 generations of my family who are Canadian until the hope provided by this bill came along. In closing, I would like to thank those mothers and other advocates who have worked alongside me to effect change. And I would like to thank again all the members here today who have worked so hard on this. I would like to implore parliamentarians to collaborate across party lines to fix once and for all this cruel, unfair, and retroactive situation. And with that, I'd like to introduce Don Chapman, who almost needs no introduction, but has been fighting on behalf for Lost Canadians for probably more than 30 years.
She's right. My story's a little different. I was stripped of my citizenship because I was born in Canada. I'm an immigrant in my own country. There are 15 categories of lost Canadians. This almost finishes it off, but not quite. We still have 2 areas to go. I've been fighting for lost Canadians since before some of the members of Parliament were born. That's how long ago I lost my citizenship. Now, this bill is absolutely huge, and I will start to say, I guess the first, since we've mentioned citizenship ministers, the first citizenship minister I went up against was Eleanor Kaplan under Jean Chrétien. And I've worked with Elizabeth and Jenny for well over 10 years. They've been tireless advocates. But today, it's more than just the first and second generation born abroad and the age 28 folks. This bill, now, providing it is exactly what it says it is, and I believe it will, and it's always the devil is in the details, this bill will be the first time in Canadian history that women achieve the same rights as men in the Citizenship Act. It will be the first time that the Citizenship Act is actually charter compliant. 95 years ago, the famous 5 women took the government to court and finally won the right for women to be considered a person. With that, they won the right to be a senator. They won the right to be a judge. They did not win the right for their own children. That won't happen until this bill becomes law. It'll be the first time. It's monumentous and has huge ramifications. As I said, we still have 2 areas that we need to clean up in the Citizenship Act, but this is a very big, very huge part of it. I'm meeting with Senator Martin this evening, who is a Conservative senator, who is the senator behind Bill S-245, and I'm hoping to get the Conservatives on board because everybody should be, 1, for the Charter, and since Canada is currently in violation, as the judge said, of several United Nations human rights conventions, no one should oppose this bill because to do that, you're going against the human rights conventions and you're going against the Charter. So I implore everybody, just anybody should want this bill. Thank you very much, and especially to everybody here. From Eleanor Kaplan on, nobody's done what you've just done. Thank you.
Combien de personnes?
C'est une super bonne question, je n'ai pas la réponse. J'aurais aimé avoir une meilleure réponse, mais ça pourrait être quelques milliers.
Quelques milliers?
Ça pourrait. Don, you have an idea of how many people this actually captures?
No. Every time, I'm always asked the same question, and the answer is no.
Oh.
No, I don't know. I'm always asked the same question, and nobody knows. I do know that Bill C-37 captured over 1 million people. How many people came to Canada? 17,000. And that probably most of the people were already in Canada. But it does justify some things. Like the first time Elizabeth and I talked, she discovered her mother was nothing but chattel in Canadian law. So this validates her mother. So, well, that won't be a citizenship issue. It will be honor of the crown, if you will. And a feminist issue, well, which is a human rights issue. So, no, I don't know, but a lot of people.
The bill sets a 3-year threshold cumulatively for presence in Canada. Can you tell us how you came up with that number? And I'm just wondering if everyone here who spoke would meet that threshold.
Yeah, it's the threshold under the naturalization law. It's quite simple. It's sort of a convention. I think it is a reasonable limit to what is a substantial connection to Canada. As I mentioned in my speech, citizenship isn't for everyone, and there is a point at which people lose connection to Canada. Certainly in the cases of these fine people behind me, that is absolutely not the case, not even close. And I would venture to think that they would qualify based on their personal stories. Look, this is about, this is about numbers, yes, and putting a reasonable approach onto something that was unreasonable, unfair, and unconstitutional. But it's also the personal stories of the people behind me, and I think they spoke quite eloquently about them. It's a story of 2 young kids whose mother was killed in a terrorist attack by Hamas, who would not be Canadian citizens but for this law, or but for perhaps a discretion that I would have to use. But a minister's discretion shouldn't be a way to determine whose people have rights and who don't.
Are you anticipating you might have to use discretion for someone who, say, spent 2.5 years in Canada instead of 3?
You always have to look at the circumstances as they arise, and it's something that obviously my team looks at quite intensely. And again, I'd have to have a real life scenario in front of me to comment on it.
Is that 3-year threshold going to apply immediately? I mean,
we have to pass the law, Mary.
Exactly, but between the Supreme Court on coming into force on June 19th, is there going to be a hiatus period where you wouldn't need to qualify?
So right now we are in an interim period, Mary, and essentially I have to use my discretion or a framework that I work with on the department that would essentially mimic what we're doing. The court gave us a deadline. We will have to go to court and speak to the bill as it stands. Hopefully this is a bill that, in my mind, is a no-brainer, can get approved at all stages, but I don't, no government fully controls Parliament.
Could you just clarify the position with adopted children adopted abroad? Would this apply to all of them, or is there a category that won't be
It doesn't,
covered?
and it is a live issue. There are some children that, if they were not adopted, would qualify under the substantial connection test. This is a bill that's still very young. We're willing to look at alternatives and propositions by members at whatever stage. As Don said, there are still elements that are open. They could be addressed in this bill, or they could not, but that will let Parliament pronounce on that.
So you do have a deadline of June 19th, according to Ontario Superior Court. You just acknowledge this bill is very young. How do you expect it to pass royal assent by then, or can it come into effect in some way without needing?
Well, we'll have to go to the court and tell them what we're doing, and perhaps seek an extension. We are still looking at a number of options. We don't want an extension ad nauseum because there are people that are being prejudiced by this right. I have a very uncomfortable role in the interim at applying a test that really should be legislative, but it's something that we'll have to speak to the court about. Again, we hope that this can be passed at all stages. It is one that was in form and substance almost entirely ready to go under Bill S-245, but for Conservative shenanigans, it's being delayed, and that's why we had to take this important step as a government bill as well.
There are concerns about so-called Canadians of convenience, folks who want to use the advantages of being a Canadian citizen without necessarily taking part in the daily life of this country. What kind of evidence are you going to require from folks to become citizens under this new bill? What are the mechanisms?
And it's important. It's an important point that, again, citizenship isn't for everyone, and there are at times people that want to gain Canadian citizenship by convenience. We believe that the naturalization test and substantial connection test is one that creates that connection to Canada. We believe that it's fair, and we believe that it's compliant. Again, I'm not a judge. I don't sit in a court, but again, we will have to address that in due course as it arises. The citizenship is very much a privilege that needs to be earned in a lot of circumstances, but certainly not in these cases where it was just patently unfair to begin with. And the law that was passed in 2009, manifestly unfair, as Don said, as the court said, especially towards women.
Question for Ms. Kwan. I must say it's fairly unusual to have a member of an opposition party at a government announcement like this. Was this a portion of any kind of side agreement in the supply and confidence deal with the Liberals to support the Liberals in this sense?
This was not part of the confidence supply agreement, but rather a collaborative effort that I, as the NDP critic for immigration, took to task. This was something that I had pursued since I've been here, even prior to being here. And when the opportunity surfaced itself with the Senate bill, and though the Senate bill was narrow in its scope, I got to work immediately, talking to the senator, talking to the Conservative members, talking to government members, talking to ministers to say, we have to do this. We have to fix this once and for all. We have to honor the families who's been impacted and to say this unjust law needs to be gotten rid of. And so to that end, we have worked tirelessly. And I see some of the staff here because this has been a long time in the making and there's been switches with ministers, and some of the staff members are here and who's worked with me alongside laboriously, I have to say, on this very technical set of amendments to fix the bill. And so I'm standing here not for partisan reasons. I'm standing here because this is the right thing to do. Not only a moral imperative to do this, but also a legal imperative. And why we have to do this is because of families like Catherine's, it's because of families like Carol, because Don Chapman, who was born here and was not deemed to be a Canadian in a weird kind of way, right? And the implications are so significant for people. I've talked to family members who've been separated from their loved ones because of this unjust law the Conservatives brought in 15 years ago. I've talked to family members where their children are deemed stateless, lost in the system because of this unjust, punitive, unconstitutional law that the Conservatives brought in. It is time to fix it, and I'm happy to work with anyone who wants to fix this, and it's not about partisan politics.
Can I just interject here? We've gotten citizenship for all kinds of people. When they get in touch with me, I never ask them their politics. They're either Canadian or they're not. That's the glue that binds us together. Canadians have not been very good at standing up for one another. So this citizenship is not partisan. Citizenship is who we are. I don't care about your political party. So everybody should be supporting this bill.
Just a clarification, is it 3 years overarchingly, 3 years within a specific period?
It doesn't have to be consecutive over a period.
Juste un détail, le projet de loi va conférer la citoyenneté aux personnes nées à l'étranger d'un parent canadien né à l'étranger aussi, mais est-ce que l'autre parent doit être né au Canada ou est-ce que ça s'applique deux parents?
Ça en prend juste un parent.
In the budget, there was a line about new legislation that would streamline refugee claims for faster decisions and quicker removals. Will that be part of this legislation, or is there more legislation to come?
It's not part of this legislation.
More legislation to come?
I think you'll see if you examine the Budget and Implementation Act, the provisions that were being contemplated.
Okay.
Any questions about the bill? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions sur le projet de loi? Okay. This is now concluded the service.
We could all sing Amazing Grace. Once we're lost, but now we're found. Thank you, Minister Miller.